Canadian JTF2 tried British selection standards. What happened was brutal. I want you to understand exactly what that word means in this context. We're not talking about challenging. We're not talking about difficult or demanding. We're talking about an experience so severe that operators who had already passed one of the most secretive and grueling selection processes in the Western world found themselves physically incapacitated, psychologically overwhelmed, and in some cases, requiring medical intervention within the first 72 hours. These were not candidates. These were fully qualified Joint Task Force 2 operators, men who had already proven themselves at the highest levels of Canadian Special Operations. Men who had completed real-world hostage rescues. Men who had deployed to Afghanistan and conducted operations that remain classified to this day. And they were systematically dismantled by a selection process designed for people who had not yet earned the right to call themselves special operators. When the exchange program concluded, and both nations assessed what had happened, the Canadian Special Operations community was forced to confront an uncomfortable question that had never been asked so directly. Had they been measuring the wrong things all along? The British were forced to confront their own question. Had their selection become so specialized that it no longer reflected operational requirements? Stay with me because this story reveals something profound about how elite military units can drift into blind spots that only exposure to Allied standards can reveal. Let me tell you about JTF2 because most people outside Canada know almost nothing about this unit despite its exceptional capabilities. Joint Task Force 2 was established in 1993 when the Canadian government transferred national counter-terrorism responsibilities from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to the Canadian Armed Forces. The unit was built from scratch, but drew heavily on expertise from Allied Special Operations Forces, including significant input from British SAS, American Delta Force, and Australian SASR. JTF2 operators are among the most carefully selected and extensively trained special operators in the world. Their selection process is deliberately opaque. The Canadian government releases almost no information about selection methodology, pass rates, or training content. What is known comes primarily from former operators and Allied personnel who have trained alongside JTF2. Selection is believed to involve extensive physical testing, psychological evaluation, and scenario-based assessments conducted over multiple weeks. Candidates are drawn from across the Canadian Armed Forces, with infantry soldiers, combat engineers, and other combat arms personnel making up the majority of successful applicants. The unit has deployed extensively since its founding. Afghanistan saw JTF2 operators conducting direct action missions, hostage rescues, and high-value target operations. Their performance earned recognition from American and British Special Operations commanders as genuinely Tier 1 capable. JTF2 operators have completed exchange tours with Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, British SAS, and Australian SAS. In these exchanges, Canadian operators have consistently demonstrated excellence. They are well regarded throughout the special operations community. They are not considered a second-tier force by any Allied nation. This reputation made what happened during the British selection exchange even more shocking. The program was designed to build interoperability between Canadian and British Special Operations forces. Part of that interoperability involves shared understanding of selection standards. The question being asked was straightforward. Were JTF2 and SAS selecting for the same qualities? Were their operators interchangeable at the foundational level? That's the answer. Discovered over 3 brutal weeks in the Welsh Mountains, was far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Now let me explain what British SAS selection actually involves, because the details matter enormously for understanding what happened. SAS selection is conducted primarily in the Brecon Beacons, a mountain range in southern Wales known for unpredictable weather, demanding terrain, and a history of candidate deaths during training exercises. The selection process unfolds over approximately 5 months, but is built around several key phases that test different aspects of candidate capability. The first phase is aptitude testing and basic fitness screening. This eliminates candidates who lack the foundational physical preparation for what follows. The second phase is hill phase. Candidates conduct a series of timed marches across the Brecon Beacons carrying weighted burgans. The distances and weight increase progressively. The time limits are unforgiving. Navigation is individual. Candidates move alone, selecting their own routes, managing their own pace, receiving no feedback until completion. The culmination of hill phase is long drag, approximately 64 kilometers of mountain navigation carrying full kit in under 20 hours. This is the test that breaks most candidates who have survived to that point. Physical capability matters enormously, but the psychological demand of sustained solo effort over that distance and duration breaks candidates whose mental resilience depends on external structure. Test week follows for those who survive hill phase, then jungle training, then combat survival, and interrogation resistance. Then continuation training that adds specialized skills. The entire process is designed to identify individuals who can operate effectively in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. It is not designed to train those individuals. It is designed to identify them. Training comes after selection. Selection identifies raw material. JTF2 selection operates differently in ways that became critical during the exchange. Canadian selection emphasizes team dynamics throughout the process. Candidates are evaluated on their ability to work within groups, support teammates, and contribute to collective success. Physical demands are substantial, but they are experienced alongside other candidates rather than in isolation. The Canadian philosophy reflects a different understanding of special operations. The belief that no operator functions alone, that team cohesion is more important than individual capability, that selection should assess how candidates perform within units rather than as isolated individuals. Both philosophies have merit. Neither is objectively correct. They produce operators optimized for different challenges. And when Canadian operators trained under Canadian philosophy encountered British selection designed around British philosophy, the mismatch became devastating. The exchange program inserted 8 JTF2 operators into an ongoing SAS selection cycle. They would complete the same tests as British candidates under the same conditions with the same evaluation standards. The goal was benchmarking. How would operators who had already passed JTF2 selection perform against the SAS standard? The unstated assumption was that they would perform well. These were experienced operators, not candidates. They had proven themselves operationally. They should have found selection challenging but manageable. That assumption was wrong. Day 1. The JTF2 operators arrived in Wales in exceptional physical condition. They had prepared specifically for the Brecon Beacons terrain. They had studied topographical maps and elevation profiles. They had acclimatized to wet, cold conditions during training in the Canadian Rockies. By objective fitness measures, they were among the most physically capable personnel in the selection cohort. The initial aptitude testing and fitness screening was unremarkable. The Canadians performed well across all assessments. Some posted times that ranked among the best in the cohort. There was no indication of what was coming. Day 3, hill phase began. The first march was 18 kilometers, with 20 kilograms in the Bergen. Time limit was 4 hours, straightforward by special operations standards. All 8 Canadians completed it within time. Several finished in the top third of the cohort. Confidence remained high. Day 5. Psst. The second march. 25 kilometers with 23 kilograms. Time limit, just over 5 hours. More demanding, but still within expected parameters. 7 of 8 Canadians completed within time. 1 finished 4 minutes over the limit. In SAS selection, that's a failure. The Canadian operator was surprised. He had never failed a timed event in his military career. He had maintained a pace that felt sustainable. He simply hadn't understood how unforgiving the standard was. Day 7. The terrain became steeper. The weight increased. The weather deteriorated into steady rain and wind that dropped apparent temperatures well below freezing. And here's where the first significant problems emerged. The Canadian operators began instinctively seeking each other out during rest periods. They clustered together at checkpoints. They encouraged each other when passing on the trails. This was natural behavior for people trained in team-based selection. It was exactly wrong for SAS selection. The directing staff noticed immediately. In SAS selection, candidates are expected to operate as individuals. Seeking support from other candidates is viewed as a psychological weakness. The mountains are supposed to be faced alone. That aloneness is the test. The directing staff didn't intervene directly. They simply noted the behavior and continued evaluating. But the Canadian operators felt something shift. Social support that had always been available in their training was now somehow wrong. They couldn't articulate why, but they sensed disapproval they didn't understand. Day 10. The marches had increased to 35 kilometers with 25 kilograms. 2 more Canadian operators failed time standards. But more concerning than the time failures was what the medical staff observed. The Canadian operators were experiencing psychological distress at levels unusual for personnel with their experience. They weren't struggling with physical demands. Their bodies were performing adequately. They were struggling with isolation. Let me explain what was happening, because this is where the psychological dynamics become critical. JTF2 operators had been trained and selected within a system that emphasized team cohesion. Their psychological resilience was calibrated to function within groups. When they faced difficult challenges, they drew strength from knowing that teammates were experiencing the same difficulty. When they pushed through exhaustion, they did so alongside others who were equally exhausted. Their mental frameworks for enduring hardship were fundamentally social. Says selection strips away all social support deliberately. You walk alone. You suffer alone. Your experience is not shared with anyone. People around you are competitors, not teammates. This isolation isn't cruelty, it's assessment. The SAS philosophy holds that operators may find themselves alone behind enemy lines, alone in captivity, alone in situations where no team exists to provide support. If your psychological resilience depends on others, you will break when others are unavailable. The Canadian operators hit this wall around day 10. Their bodies remained capable. Their minds began fragmenting. The isolation they faced wasn't just physical, it was existential. Everything they understood about who they were as operators was embedded in team identity. The Brecon beacons were dissolving that identity with every solo kilometer. If you're finding this analysis valuable and want to understand more about how special operations psychology works, hit that subscribe button right now. I am releasing a video next week about why Australian and New Zealand SAS developed completely opposite approaches to team selection. Despite being closer geographically and culturally than any other special operations forces. What happened when they ran joint exercises will surprise you. But right now, let's continue, because day 12 is when things became truly brutal. Day 12, long drag, 64 kilometers, full kit. Under 20 hours. This is the test that breaks approximately 70% of candidates who reach it. The Canadian operators knew what was coming. They had prepared specifically for this event. They understood the distance, the weight, the terrain, the time limit. What they didn't fully understand was what 20 hours alone in the mountains would do to minds calibrated for team dynamics. The first Canadian operator withdrew at the 30-kilometer mark. Not from physical failure, from psychological collapse. He simply sat down and could not make himself continue. The isolation, the absence of teammates, the endless mountains stretching ahead with no one to share the burden, it overwhelmed something inside him that physical training had never touched. The medical staff extracted him. He was physically uninjured, was psychologically devastated. The second and third Canadian operators withdrew within 3 hours of the first. Their experiences were similar. Physical capability remained. Psychological capacity had depleted. One later described feeling like he was disappearing into the landscape. Like his sense of self was dissolving because there was no one else to reflect that self back to him. This description is psychologically significant. It suggests that his identity as an operator was fundamentally relational. When relations were stripped away, identity became unstable. By hour 18 of long drag, only 2 of the 8 Canadian operators were still moving. One finished in 19 hours and 20 minutes, 20 minutes over the limit. A failure. The other finished in 19 hours and 43 minutes. Also a failure. 0 Canadian operators completed long drag within the required time. 0. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means. 8 operators who had already passed one of the world's most demanding special operations selections. 8 operators who had proven themselves in combat. 8 operators who were respected throughout Allied special operations communities. None of them met the British standard for basic selection completion. This was not about physical capability. Medical assessments confirmed that most of the Canadians remained physically capable of completing the march. They failed because their psychological architecture was incompatible with the specific demands of SAS selection. And here's the insight that changed how both nations thought about selection. Neither group had failed. The Canadians hadn't failed as operators. The British standard hadn't failed as an assessment tool. What had happened was exposure of a profound difference in what each selection was designed to identify. JTF2 selection identifies operators who function exceptionally well within teams. SAS selection identifies operators who function exceptionally well as individuals. Both capabilities matter. Neither is sufficient alone. But the selection processes had become so specialized that they were producing operators optimized for different challenges. While assuming they were producing universal capability, the Canadian Special Operations community responded to this experience with remarkable institutional honesty. They didn't dismiss the results as irrelevant. They didn't claim that SAS selection was inappropriate or unfair. They examined what the results revealed about their own selection methodology. The examination produced several key insights. First, Canadian selection had drifted toward team assessment partly because team assessment is easier to observe and evaluate. It's harder to assess individual psychological resilience than team dynamics. Over time, the easier assessment had received more emphasis than the harder one. Second, Canadian operators had become genuinely excellent at team operations, but had not developed the individual resilience that solo operations might require. This wasn't a failure of individual operators. It was a structural feature of how those operators had been developed. Third, the modern operational environment increasingly required both capabilities. JTF2 operators might conduct team-based hostage rescues, but also might need to survive alone if separated during operations. Selection that only assessed one capability produced operators with blind spots. The response was recalibration. Canadian selection didn't abandon T-based assessment, but it added solo phases that specifically tested individual resilience. Candidates now face extended periods of isolation during selection. They must demonstrate psychological stability without team support. The British response was equally thoughtful. The SAS had always known their selection identified a specific type of operator, but the Canadian experience raised questions about whether that specificity had become too narrow. Were they selecting for solo mountain navigation capability while underweighting team dynamics that most operations required? The data suggested possible drift. SAS selection had become so focused on identifying individuals who could endure isolation that team capabilities were assessed primarily in later training rather than initial selection. Operators who excelled individually sometimes struggled to integrate into operational teams. The four-person patrol dynamics that defined SAS operations required collaboration skills that individual selection didn't fully assess. The response was integration. SAS selection now includes team-based assessments earlier in the process. The solo demands remain, but they're balanced against team scenarios that reveal collaborative capability. Neither nation abandoned their core selection philosophy. The Canadians still emphasize team dynamics. The British still emphasize individual resilience. But both now assess the other capability more deliberately than they did before. I need to take you deeper into why this matters, because the Canadian experience reveals something important about institutional drift that applies far beyond military selection. Every organization develops assessment systems that reflect their values and requirements. Over time, those systems become self-reinforcing. People who succeed under the system rise to leadership positions. They believe in the system because it identified them. They resist changes to the system because changes imply their own selection might have been flawed. This creates institutional momentum that can carry organizations away from their actual requirements. JTF2 selection drifted toward team emphasis not because individual resilience became less important, but because team assessment became institutionally comfortable. The people designing and conducting selection were team-oriented operators who valued team dynamics, naturally emphasized what they valued. SAS selection drifted toward individual emphasis for similar reasons. Solo mountain navigation became the defining test, not because team dynamics became less important, but because individual assessment became institutionally embedded. Generations of operators who had proven themselves through long drag believed that long drag was the essential test. Both drifts were natural, both drifts were dangerous, and neither drift became visible until external comparison forced honest assessment. This is why allied exchange programs matter so much. It's not just for interoperability, but for institutional health. Organizations cannot see their own blind spots. They need external perspective to reveal what internal assessment obscures. The 8 Canadian operators who experienced such difficulty during SAS selection were not failures. They were diagnostic instruments. Their experience revealed something about Canadian selection that Canadian selection could not have revealed about itself. The British selection staff who observed the Canadian struggle gained insights about their own system that internal assessment had not produced. The brutality of what happened served a purpose beyond the immediate experience. Now let me tell you what happened to those 8 operators because their subsequent careers illustrate the complexity of this situation. All 8 returned to JTF2. None were viewed as having failed. Their experience in Wales was understood as diagnostic rather than evaluative. They remained fully qualified operators with unchanged standing within their unit. Several went on to extremely successful careers, including combat deployments, where they performed with distinction. The skills and psychology that made SAS selection difficult had no negative impact on their operational effectiveness within team-based operations, but their experience changed how they understood themselves. Several later reported that Wales had revealed something they hadn't known about their own psychology. They had believed themselves resilient in all contexts. They discovered that their resilience was context-dependent. This self-knowledge made them more effective leaders because they could recognize similar context dependence in soldiers they commanded. One of the 8 went on to become a senior instructor in Canadian Special Operations training. He specifically incorporated solo isolation phases based on his Welsh experience. He didn't want candidates to experience what he had experienced, but he wanted them to develop capabilities that would prevent such experiences during operations. The relationship between JTF2 and SAS actually strengthened after this exchange. Both units recognized that honest assessment, even when the results were unflattering, built more robust partnerships than mutual flattery. The Canadians had demonstrated institutional humility by acknowledging what the experience revealed. The British had demonstrated institutional maturity by not treating the Canadian struggle as proof of superiority. Let me share what a senior British officer observed about this dynamic because it captures something essential about professional military culture. He noted that the Canadians arrived confident and left humbled, but they didn't leave bitter, they left curious. They wanted to understand what had happened and why. That curiosity is what separates professional military forces from the rest. Anyone can fail. Only professionals learn from failure systematically. This observation reflects a broader truth about elite unit culture. The units that remain elite are those that treat every experience as information. Failures are diagnostic. Successes are diagnostic. The goal is never to protect ego, but to improve capability. When ego protection becomes more important than capability improvement, elite units begin their decline. The Canadian-British exchange could have produced defensiveness. The Canadians could have claimed the assessment was unfair. The British could have been dismissive of Canadian capability. Neither response emerged because both organizations maintained professional cultures that prioritize learning over ego. What does this mean for the future of special operations selection? The trend across Western special operations is toward balanced assessment that includes both individual resilience and team dynamics. The Canadian experience accelerated this trend by providing a dramatic demonstration of what happens when selection becomes too specialized. Modern operations require operators who can function effectively alone and within teams, who can endure isolation and contribute to collaboration, who have individual resilience and collective capability. Selection processes are evolving to assess this full range, rather than optimizing for one dimension. Technology is also changing the equation. Modern communications mean that true isolation is rarer than it once was. Operators can often maintain contact even during solo missions. This reduces the operational requirement for extreme individual isolation. Tolerance while maintaining the requirement for individual decision-making capability under stress. Selection is adapting to reflect this changed operational reality. But the fundamental insight from Wales remains relevant: cannot assess what you don't test. Canadian selection didn't assess solo psychological resilience because it didn't include solo phases of sufficient duration and intensity. British selection didn't fully assess team dynamics because it didn't include team scenarios early enough in the process. Both organizations were confident in their assessment systems until external comparison revealed the gaps. This suggests that exchange programs should be viewed as essential rather than optional. Every special operations unit should regularly expose its personnel to allied selection standards, not to prove superiority but to identify blind spots. The discomfort of discovering limitations is far less costly than the operational failures that undiscovered limitations might produce. Let me bring this to a close with some thoughts on what this story reveals about excellence more broadly. The Canadian operators who struggled in Wales were excellent. Now they remain excellent. Their excellence was revealed to be contextual rather than universal. They were excellent at what their training had prepared them for. They were unprepared for what their training had not addressed. This is true of all excellence. No one is excellent at everything. The highest performers in any domain have developed capabilities specific to that domain. When they encounter different domains, their excellence may not transfer. Recognizing this is not a diminishment of excellence. It's an acknowledgement of what excellence actually is. The British operators who conduct SAS selection are also contextually excellent. Their capabilities are optimized for the demands that British selection emphasizes. Those capabilities might not transfer fully to contexts that emphasize different demands. The solo resilience that makes them exceptional in the Brecon Beacons might not translate to team dynamics in all operational contexts. The wisdom is in understanding what each type of excellence requires and building systems that develop the full range of capabilities that operations demand. Neither the Canadian model nor the British model is complete in isolation. Each develops essential capabilities that the other underweights. The most effective approach combines both, selecting and training operators who can function individually and collectively depending on what each mission requires. What do you think about this analysis? Does the idea that experienced operators could struggle so severely in unfamiliar selection contexts challenge your assumptions about military excellence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm particularly interested in hearing from anyone with special operations experience who can speak to the differences between team-based and individual assessment approaches. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. I release detailed analyses like this every week, always focused on understanding the deeper dynamics that shape military effectiveness. The next video drops in 4 days. I'm examining why American and Canadian special operations diverge so significantly. Despite sharing the longest undefended border in the world and more military cooperation than almost any other national pairing, the historical forces that produce this divergence reveal something surprising about how geography shapes military culture in ways that political alignment cannot overcome. Until next time, remember that context shapes capability in ways we often don't recognize until that context changes. The operators who excelled in team-based environments struggled in individual environments not because they were weak, but because they were strong in specific ways. Understanding your own contextual strengths and limitations is essential for continued growth. That's the lesson from Wales. That's the lesson that applies far beyond special operations. And that is why understanding what happened to JTF2 operators during British selection matters. For anyone seeking to understand what excellence actually requires, the answer is never simple. The answer is always contextual. And the wisdom is in understanding both the power and the limits of whatever context has shaped your own development.